my pleasure and honor to introduce Frank Rock.
Well, thank you and welcome everybody. And excuse me, I'm a little wired up here today. They're trying something new or the presentation I'm giving today, so I agreed to go along with that. How many are here for the first time? I'd like to see. Great. Nothing I love to see than faces I don't recognize. So this is a treat for me because I love giving out this story to people who have heard bits and pieces about this disaster, the second worst disaster in the history of California. And I hope today I can give you some more insight as to what was the cause of the St. Francis Dam disaster in 1928, how it evolved, and how it reflects on us today. We'll get through the lecture, and at the end we'll have a short Q&A, and then we'll get on the bus for those who are going to be going on the tour out to the site itself. At the turn of the 19th to 20th century, Los Angeles had grown from a lawless, sleepy pueblo on the edge of the Mojave Desert to a potential metropolis, though at the time not on the same scale of New York or San Francisco. If LA intended to grow and annex the vast San Fernando Valley to the north and find a way to deal with a region that, on average, experienced 2 to 3 year long droughts every decade, it needed more of one thing, and that would be water. Enter Fred Eaton, a man with a plan for the city and himself. A son of the founding family of Pasadena, California, the well-mannered and educated former LA mayor and now founder and former head of the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply, which would be the DWP, believed it was possible to build the largest gravity-driven aqueduct since ancient Rome from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles, a distance of 233 miles. He thought with access to the vast Sierra Nevada snow peaks, enough water would be available for the growth stop at Los Angeles. Also entering the picture, the current head engineer of the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply, William Mulholland. The original rags to riches story. Born in Belfast, Ireland in 1855, the nearly illiterate Mulholland left his homeland at 15 with his brother Hugh, working his way to America through a series of jobs such as cabin boy, store clerk, and prospector, until he found his way to Los Angeles, where he found work as a ditch tender and digger. He worked days and self-taught himself at night in the sciences of engineering, hydrology, and geology, as well as Shakespeare, working his way up to chief engineer. He had established a reputation for getting large, difficult projects done on time and on or under budget. So, on a buckboard trip to the Owens Valley in 1904, Eaton took Mulholland along to ascertain if there was truly enough water to satisfy Los Angeles, and if it was feasible to build an aqueduct. Mulholland concluded it could be done. After securing bonds to fund the project, Los Angeles, through Mulholland, Eaton, and Bureau of Reclamation Chief Joseph Lippincott, bought the land of the Owens Valley. Bought the land and water rights of the Owens Valley through albeit unethical but legal means, and started the project in 1907. Mulholland built the aqueduct, stretching from the eastern Sierras through the Mojave Desert, over and through mountains. 233 miles of pipe, open and covered channels, siphons, and siphons. On November 5th, 1913, after 6 years of back and record-breaking labor, water was delivered to Los Angeles via the Cascades at Owens Mouth, today north of Sylmar, to 40,000 spectators. It was here where Mulholland gave his most famous speech, where he simply said, "There it is, take it." Over the next decade, Los Angeles would realize they had fallen victim to its own success. From 1905 to 1919, the population tripled. The powers that bought up and invested in the San Fernando Valley did not underestimate its value, but did underestimate how fast it and Los Angeles would grow. Land prices escalated 500% before the aqueduct broke ground. Between 1914 to 1923, cultivation of the San Fernando Valley escalated 567%. Because of the rapid growth, combined with a series of droughts in 1918 to 19 and 1923 to 1925, the aqueduct was falling short of providing enough water from the eastern Sierras. Mulholland predicted the evolving crisis, so he sought several avenues of relief. First was to install additional wells along the southern side of the San Fernando Valley to draft off groundwater to eliminate waste. In 1919, Los Angeles petitioned the state and was granted the right to sink 52 turbine wells into the Owens Valley to collect the groundwater, which would be fed to Los Angeles. This was the impetus for the California water wars of 1924 through 1927. We'll discuss that later. About this time, Mulholland realized the aqueduct had one major flaw. There was no backup reserve for times of drought or disaster. Only 27% of the state's reserve water was south of San Andreas. So along with the wells in San Fernando, Mulholland spearheaded a public works project to enlarge the capacity of 7 existing reservoirs in Los Angeles and build 2 new large capacity reservoirs, one in Weed Canyon at 7,500 acre-feet. This became the Mulholland Dam, today known as Lake Hollywood. The other, of similar design with over 4 times the capacity, to be built in a small community named LeBrun in upper San Francisco Canyon, 45 miles north of Los Angeles. This would be the St. Francis Dam. Used as a staging area for the construction of the 7-mile-long Lake Elizabeth Tunnel, part of the aqueduct project, in 1910, Mulholland was taken by the natural long and wide flat plain that funneled into the narrow canyon. Tests were taken as to its viability for a future dam and reservoir. San Francisco Canyon was Mulholland's second choice for placement of the dam. Originally, Big Tujunga Canyon, just north of Sunland, was to be the site. But landowners caught wind of his intent and raised their price significantly. Mulholland refused their offer and opted for San Francisco. Construction began in April 1924. The dam's configuration incorporated a curved plan laid out on a constant radius of 500 feet with a series of 5-foot-high vertical steps. Material to mix the concrete came from 1/4 to 2 miles downstream and 30 feet beneath the stream bed. A batch plant to mix the concrete was built on the downstream toe of the structure. Trucks would dump their loads of unwashed aggregate into the mixes, a flaw in the construction. Towers were built to convey the cement to the growing levels of the structure. During the design phase, 10 feet were added to the height of the dam to coincide with Los Angeles water consumption of 1924. 1 year after construction started, another 10 feet was added to the design for the same reason, requiring the addition of a 600-foot-long wing dike along the northwest ridge abutment, plus an auxiliary spillway weir along the adjacent saddle. This increased the capacity of the dam a whole 1/3. St. Francis Dam opened with little fanfare on May 1926, less than 2 years after breaking ground. She stood 205 feet at the center, 150 feet thick at its base, 16 feet wide at its crest, holding back a 2.5 to 3 mile long lake, over 38,000 acre-feet, roughly 12.5 billion gallons of water, a 1-year reserve for Los Angeles. Now we'll go to the story of the time leading up to the demise of the dam. From March 11th to the 13th on 1928 is a series of events. On March 11th, William Hoke and his mother observed leaks coming from the west abutment of the dam. They made this trek several times during the week, coming and going to their home at Power Station 1, 5 miles up canyon. The power of the leaks appeared to be increasing with each trip. That same day, Abigail Riley and her husband Bill were coming back from a trip in Lancaster, Antelope Valley, where they parked their car on the road adjacent to the dam and walked down on it. As you can see, the people on the left there. People normally would come down and view the beautiful landscape down canyon. Well, at this point, Bill told his wife Abigail and their 2 daughters to get back in the car immediately. And then they got into the car and sped off home where they lived in Piru. Abigail was asking, "What is the problem? Why are you driving so fast?" And he said, "Didn't you see the leaks on the side of the dam there? This dam is not safe." And as they're driving past the power station's community, she said to Bill, why would they build a dam here so close to all these people? That wouldn't be right. And he says, "No matter, if the power goes out in our home at night, you'll know that the dam had broken. It took out our power grid." That would be very prescient of Bill. Next day, 10:30 a.m., March 12th, the famous story of Tony Harnessfeger, the dam keeper. Tony worked for William Mulholland for 14 years, first as a guard on the aqueduct, and he became his head dam keeper. Tony was always made note that he didn't think the dam was that safe as well. He was concerned with the leaks that were growing. So one morning, 10:30 a.m. on March 12th, Tony calls down to William Mulholland and says, we have some leaks coming out of the west abutment here and the water is dirty. That would imply that the dam might be in peril, where it might be eating away at the foundation because the water was dirty. Mulholland, along with his chief engineer, Harvey Van Norman, and Mulholland's son Perry, who would work as his chauffeur from time to time, drove up and made a cursory inspection of the dam. The winds were blowing so strong down canyon they were pushing water through the eyelet, the slits. The dam itself was less than 3 feet from cresting. It was at its max. So they did an inspection on it, and Mulholland was stated as saying all dams leak. This is the driest dam that he's ever built. He made intentions of checking on the leaks more. What, in reality, Tony had viewed was a runoff from a 9-inch ceramic pipe that had been installed to a leak up on the wing dike, up on the upper west abutment. And they had fed the water off from that leak running down the side of the canyon, the abutment to the dam, I'm sorry. And there was loose filled dirt that it took down with it. But that didn't belay the fact that there still was water coming out from the side of the dam, and it had changed in capacity from day to day. Moving along, at 8:30 to 9 p.m. that same day, that evening, Ray Sylvie and a Mr. Tate from Powerhouse 1, they were employees at Powerhouse 1, crossed a section of the road. I'm using this picture as a reference now for the next series of events to show what was going on. That is a road, the San Francisco Canyon Road, just above the dam there. The two employees noticed that the road had already slipped 12 inches that preceding evening, and they had to make their way over that road. So apparently something was happening to the mountainside. The mountainside was starting to move. At 11:30 that night, Powerhouse 1 warehouseman Dean Keegi, while en route to the night shift work, saw lights at the canyon floor below the dam, probably from the dam keeper's cottage, as the dam itself was not equipped with lights. 11:35 p.m., two other Powerhouse employees, Elmer Steen and the Powerhouse 1 nurse, Catherine Spahn, reported seeing nothing unusual. Now, at 11:50, a carpenter by the name of Ace Hopewell, driving a sidecar motorcycle, went past St. Francis at about 11:50. He didn't see anything unusual until about a mile past the dam. He heard some rumblings back down the canyon. He got off his motorcycle, let it idle, looked out into the water, couldn't see anything unusual. Hearing stones and rocks fall into the canyon was not unusual, as there was many rock slides and earth movements up along the reservoir all the time. He went on to Powerhouse 1, not knowing what was going on. At 11:57 and a half, Powerhouse 1 experiences a bump on the system, spiking a voltage surge to 90. After a series of tests over the next hour and repeated unanswered phone calls to Power Station 1, two workers drove down canyon to San Francisco Canyon Road to assess the situation. After reaching a landslide blocking the road, they called via a landline back to Powerhouse 1 and stated, "Your lake is dry, St. Francis is down." Ace Hopewell proved to be the last person to see the St. Francis in one piece and lived to tell about it. At 11:57 and a half, the lights in Los Angeles flickered. The 70 kV Boral power line, which extended across San Francisco Canyon and east into Palmdale, had just gone down with a landslide on the east abutment of the dam. St. Francis had just broke. The floodwaters rushing out of the reservoir at 1.7 million cubic feet per second were 5 minutes from reaching Power Station 2, 1¼ miles downstream, with its 16 structures and 70 employees and family members. The structure here stood 65 feet tall, made of iron and concrete, housing two huge turbines. 100 feet above the canyon floor, surge chamber operator E.H. Thomas, who lived with his mother, when they were both awakened, lived with his mother, and they were both awakened by what they thought was an earthquake. Thomas assured his mother that it would be all right, but that the shaking wouldn't stop. The lights in the house went out, and so he knew something that was going wrong, and it wasn't just an earthquake. He dressed himself and ran to the ridge that you see right where the two pipes going, the two pinstocks are running down the hill. He ran down to that ledge with a flashlight, shined it down into what was only water. And he could see a high water mark that the waters had already receded 20 feet by the time he had gotten there. He also realized that the power station was under that water along with the community and their communal house. Carl Matthews, another worker, was working in the basement building furniture. At 12:05, Lou Burns, an on-duty engineer that night, was on the phone to either LA or Power Station 1 when he said, "It sounds like an earthquake," and then the phone went dead. Power Station 2 was crushed like a crate of eggs, leaving only the two turbines locked down on their foundations. The entire community was destroyed, 67 people killed with 3 survivors. The teacher, Miss Small, and most of the students in this picture perished. 3 survivors from the community were Lillian Curtis and her son Daniel, and a worker named Ray Rising. Both of them had similar stories to tell that night, being awakened by a eerie mist that came through the canyon. Lillian Curtis's husband, Lyman, told Lillian to get into the bedroom, get their young son, and go out the back window and start climbing up the mountainside while he went in to get their other 2 daughters. As he did that, the water took out the cabin and killed the 2 daughters and Lyman. Daniel and Lillian scurried up the hillside as the waters are literally licking at their heels until they got up to a fire break above the canyon floor. Ray Rising literally had the same story with a wife and 3 daughters in his cabin. He was pushed off his front porch, floated downstream, fighting broken trees, buildings, electrical wire. He was able to get himself onto what was left of the roof of a cabin and rode it out until it crashed into a hillside, and he rushed up to the same fire break. The 3 people plus 1 dog were rescued that next morning. The floodwaters at this point were going down Drinkwater Flat, and they were picking up speed and power from the narrow canyon, gouging out a 60-foot hole and snapping at it to San Fernando. That's that pipe you see there. That was the pipe leading into the San Fernando aqueducts. All farms and ranches downstream were damaged, if not outright destroyed. Ranchers, families of Arachio, Ruiz, Smith were all victims of loss, both family and land. Most noteworthy was the Harry Carey Ranch and Trading Post, owned by the silent screen cowboy Harry Carey. The entire ranch plus his 2 caretakers was wiped out. The floodwaters widened and slowed as they exited the canyon. The debris the floodwaters collected increased with each yard, tearing up everything in its path. At 12:40 p.m., the floodwaters reached the Edison substation 8 miles from the break. Now more than several minutes before the floodwaters reached this point, the people living at this substation were awakened by a fire that had broken out in one of the cabins, and that was caused by a short in an oil switch, which was caused by the powers from the power of the flood taking down power poles up the canyon. Now imagine, if you will, they had a clear view up the canyons unobstructed of the floodwaters, not knowing what it was. The sky was being lit up with surges as the floodwaters took out power poles coming down the canyon, and they could hear the rumblings coming closer and closer. 2 men went down into the canyon across the road from where the houses were sitting, and just as they got down, the floodwaters came down the canyon and took out 1 man. The other man was able to get up to the road and flag down a truck, which took them into Newhall, where he contacted the sheriff, and they started the notifications downstream. And the water and debris now entered the Santa Clara River Basin, heading northwest, taking out the only bridge connecting the ridge route with Los Angeles. This is most of that bridge, 1 mile west of where it stood Heading into the neighboring Castaic, the floodwaters took out a series of tourist cabins and their residents. Turning west, the flood was now at its deepest flatland depth of 70 feet. At 1:18, the waters reached the LA-Ventura County borders. Here it was flooding the banks of the Santa Clara River, 30 to 60 feet above the river bottom. Here at Kemp, a Southern Pacific Railroad a Southern Pacific Railroad railhead and a section called Blue Cut. An Edison work crew of 150 men had been camped for several months, installing a communication line. Word never reached the men in advance, as the water caught them literally sleeping in their tents. The foreman there at that time, named Ed Locke, who was considered a true hero, was able to awaken as many men as possible as the floodwaters came into the cabins. Some men were fortunate enough to live when their cabins, made up of just canvas army cabins, were sealed tight. They were literally in an air bubble. And there are other stories where men who left their cabin flaps open and were literally drowned in their sleep. Some rode out the floodwaters in these tents, scratching and gnawing through their canvas encampments, taking out fingernails and teeth. Some actually made it out on top. Other stories of men being found the next morning, dry as a bone, but completely knocked out in a debris field above the floodplain. The oddity of this area was the fact that Blue Cut was a sharp hairpin in the river. And as the water flowed through, it was so narrow, the floodwaters had to come back on itself, causing a whirlpool and an eddy, if you speak. So until the water built up enough power to push through, again, the men were caught in a whirlpool, and so strong and so fast that it literally threw men out of their cabins up onto dry land, as at one point I told you. So every bridge and rail from Castaic to the Pacific was out or damaged. 11 miles of Highway 126 between Piru and Castaic was gone, affecting 23,684 acres of prime land, 7,902 acres of citrus, walnuts, apricots, grapes, and alfalfa. At 2:20 a.m., the flood reached Fillmore and Bardstown. This was the widest point of the flood at nearly 3 miles. The Bardstown Bridge connection to Moore Park was washed downstream 1 mile, nearly intact. All kinds of stories keep coming out of Fillmore and Santa Paula I still find today. The one most endearing or tragic to me was a family of 10 who parked their car alongside the Bardstown Bridge, where the father got out after he was being flagged down by a neighbor to come help them. As he got out of the car and helped his neighbor, he got back in time just to see the car being washed down with the entire family downstream. They were all lost. Another oddity is how the flood was so random. It would take whole families, as I just said, and then it would just take one little girl, throw her out of a house, and then they'd find her totally dry, yards down from where her house stood. Another woman tells us a story when they had the 50th reunion of the disaster back in 1978. She tells of how she was washed into a tree. The force of the flood literally tore all the clothes off of her body. She was nude in a tree. She was like about 9 years old. A man rescued her from the tree, took her from the tree onto dry land. They met 50 years later at the reunion, and she still couldn't look him in the eye because she was so embarrassed. So, at Fillmore was the spot of the most deaths in one area, where 62 were killed and 175 homes lost. At 3:05 a.m., the Santa Paula was next in line for the attack of the flood. At this point, the flood was a slow-moving debris field of water, rocks, trees, buildings, and livestock. Entire homes were lifted off their foundations and left in orchards or the yard of the local school. Santa Paula sustained the most structural damage at 300 homes and 56 dead. Here at Santa Paula was a story of a man they deemed the Paul Revere of the flood. His name was Thornton Edwards. He was a state police officer, and he rode his motorcycle down to the lower edges of the city and got everybody out of every other house to get out of the homes and get to safety. He would tell one house, go back and tell the other house, while he went 2 houses over and got everybody out. And the irony of the whole thing is the man was deemed a hero, but he was also one of the biggest racists and thugs in town. It's history. You know, it was reported that most of the populace in Santa Paula didn't even know the existence of the St. Francis Dam or William Mulholland. But apparently one woman in Santa Paula did when she posted a homemade sign in the ruins of her property that read, "Kill Mulholland." At 5:25 a.m., over 5.5 hours and 53.8 miles later, the floodwaters limped into the Pacific Ocean at El Rio below Ventura. Debris caused a gray silt to the Channel Islands 7 miles out. The next day, debris was 30 miles out. Debris was also found on Catalina. Bodies were found on the beaches of San Diego. On March 14th, this picture was on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, and every major newspaper in the country carried the news of the St. Francis Dam disaster on their front pages. When the sun arose the next morning and rescue workers and engineers could make their way upstream, they were greeted by this horrific sight. William Mulholland's second greatest achievement lay in ruins, and the reservoir it held back drained in less than an hour. People were going to want to know why one of the greatest civil engineering projects failed and who to blame. This is a picture of William Mulholland the day after the disaster with his chief engineer, Harvey Van Norman. It is said that this is the disaster destroyed Mulholland. You can see him here. He's not dressed in his work clothes or field clothes. He's dressed to go to a funeral. He was notified about 1 a.m. from by phone from his daughter Rose that the flood had taken out St. Francis, and his only response was, "God, please don't let there be dead people." Rescue stations and relief were put in operation as news filtered back about the disaster. Radio stations alerted the communities post-flood of the need for clothes and shelter for the victims. Local, county, state, and federal law enforcement arrived, but some of the Los Angeles police who came to help were turned back. People didn't want any help from Los Angeles, being as they thought that they were the cause. Boy Scouts, high school students, Red Cross set up all up and down the flood path. President Calvin Coolidge offered the help of the military if it was needed. Searches for injured and dead went on for weeks as the number of the lost went past 400. Over the next month, the skies over Fillmore and Santa Paula were filled with smoke as excess debris and animal carcasses were burned. Many animals had to be destroyed after attempts to corral them proved futile, as the panic-stricken animals were killing themselves trying to escape their pens. Destroying them was the most humane thing they could do for the animals. Recovery of the dead was ongoing from Newhall to the Pacific. Makeshift morgues were set up in the local pharmacy and dance hall in Newhall. The same in Piru. The local dance hall was used as bodies were brought in by volunteers using flatbed trucks and mule-driven buckboards. In Fillmore, bodies were brought to the playing field of Fillmore High School, where they were hosed off and then taken into the cafeteria, where they lay until identified. No less than 20 entire families were wiped out from the flood. Those who weren't drowned outright were beaten to death by the debris. Bodies filled with silt were found up in the canyons, as well as some found impaled on trees. Funerals went on for weeks, from San Francisco Canyon to Santa Paula. Entire families, like the Ruiz family, who lost 6, and the Lunas, who lost 7. Some victims were from out of state, and their bodies were sent back home as far as Virginia. This is a viewing of the Ruiz family funeral. And you can see in the foreground was remnants from the flood. That's what's left of a piano, I believe. And in the background is a hearse. You can see it, but the people are filtering across the stream bed from a small cemetery that's still up on the side of the canyon today. William S. Hart is seen here with his cowboys dedicating a plaque to the unknown, and especially one little boy who was later identified. Oops. This is William S. Hart with pinning a Medal of Bravery on young Luis Rivera, a 14-year-old boy who saved his two sisters in Castaic by literally running across the field with them in tow just ahead of the floodwaters. Next to him is, and I'm not kidding when I tell you, this was called the pastor of the disaster, Wolcott Evans. This man ministered to the community here for about 25 years. He would tend to the funerals of people he had married and baptized. At one point, the Reverend had to be hospitalized for exhaustion, being as getting no sleep and just totally the depression of the whole existing disaster. No less than 7 local, state, and federal investigations were begun within a week after the disaster. Results stated that the failure was due to poor geology, and those in charge were not seeking sound geology input from more than one geologist. Ultimately, the investigation held by the LA Coroner's Office stated in brief, the construction of a municipal dam should never be left to the sole judgment of one man, no matter how eminent. Their findings were the groundwork for the creation of the Division of Safety of Dams. In the end, Mulholland, that is Los Angeles, accepted full responsibility for the disaster and paid out virtually all claims, roughly $5 million, which today would be, in today's dollars, would be $60 million. Quoting Charles Outland from Man-Made Disaster, in the final analysis, however, the responsibility was his alone, and let the record show that he was big enough to accept it. Quote, don't blame me, don't blame anybody else. You just fasten it on me. If there is an error of human judgment, I was that human. William Mulholland, unquote. And what became of William Mulholland's projects? All of his previous city projects were put under scrutiny, especially Mulholland Dam. Though initially deemed safe after the St. Francis collapse, Mulholland ordered the water drawn down 50% for inspection, whereupon 2 investigations found that Mulholland Dam showed similar flaws as St. Francis, that the dam lacked uplift relief and sufficient base to withstand a substantial seismic event. Also in 1929, the Forks Dam project, then near completion in San Gabriel Canyon north of Azusa, was halted. It would have been the world's largest concrete arch dam at the time, at 425 feet tall and holding 240,000 acre-feet of water, 6 times the size of St. Francis. Its west abutment was sliding and could not be controlled. This stop event was resulted from the new Division of Dam Safety. So why did St. Francis fail? In 1992, Dr. J. David Rogers, a renowned forensics geologist and engineer, published the St. Francis Dam Disaster Revisited, which is widely believed to be the definitive explanation of why St. Francis failed. Through years of study, interviews, and investigations, this is the sequence of the dam's failure. The resulting slide of the east abutment was the first start of the break of the dam. I like to call this the world's worst coincidence. For one thing is, only the center part of the dam had relief wells. That is why the main section of the center section was standing. The geology, science of the time couldn't determine what was happening on the east side of the dam, the right side there. The whole mountain was moving. It wasn't just a landslide, the whole mountain was moving. It was called a Paleolithic landslide. And on the left side, the waters from the hillside from the rains of that winter had soaked the conglomerate, which ultimately, when you put it in water, it would dissolve, but it was pressing up against the east section of the dam. So what you had was pressure, a landslide coming from one side, pressure coming from another side, and you had the resultant pressure of the dam itself pushing up underneath the dam. It didn't have a prayer. The waters then started gouging out the lower east section of the dam, starting the flow. This is just minutes before the break. The landslide took out the whole section of the east abutment, causing it to corrupt. So now the whole structure there was no way that the dam could be saved. Water was flowing out. For a moment, the floodwaters were stopped by the amount of the landslide coming down and blocking it up, but because there was no structure to the slide, it was rapidly washed out by the 1.7 million cubic feet of water pushing it out. The resultant flow took out the rest of the dam, corrupted the whole sections. The west section now started to crumble and fall apart. All this is happening in about less than 2 minutes. Large sections scoured across the front section of the dam ultimately. When the waters came down to like about 60 feet, the resultant blocks fell over after a 60-foot hole had been gouged out of the east abutment. In closing, there are several epilogues on the key figures and structures relating to the worst disaster in Southern California history. Fred Eaton. He and Mulholland parted ways after a long friendship after Eaton retained the Long Valley property he had bought for himself during the Owens Valley land grab. He speculated that he would sell Long Valley back to Los Angeles at a huge profit to himself. Had LA bought the property and constructed a massive reservoir there, then there would not have been any need for St. Francis. Mulholland never gave in to Eaton's excessive price of $1 million. Over the years, Eaton tried his hand at land management and cattle ranching, all failures. On March 11, 1934, he died in Los Angeles, virtually penniless. He was 78. William Mulholland, after taking blame for the St. Francis collapse, retired from public service in 1929 at age 74. Although he was still called upon to consult on various water-related projects, he became more and more reclusive. Old friends were shunning him, and the press vilified him. He would never be the same chief. On July 22, 1935, Mulholland died in Los Angeles after several years of being plagued by debilitating strokes and depression. Construction on the Colorado River Aqueduct ceased for 1 minute in tribute. Waters from the Highway Dam were also shut off in his memory. It is said that Bill Mulholland was the last victim of the St. Francis Dam. Power Station 2. A temporary power grid was set up immediately after the flood, so within a year the structure was online again, built on its old foundation site. The existing turbines were cleaned and put back into service and are still functioning today with one added turbine. The cottages were rebuilt in the adjacent canyon. The St. Francis Reservoir was replaced about 3 years later with an earthen compacted dam in Bouquet Canyon to the east of San Francisco Canyon. In 1929, 2 boys were playing on the St. Francis ruins. One of the boys picked up a small snake and playfully tossed it at the other. The boy was startled by the snake and fell. The boy bled to death. En route to the hospital. After this incident and the obvious bad PR, the standing ruins were causing the DWP, the city powers, decided to demolish the remaining ruins. Bulldozers, jackhammers, and dynamite were brought in, and the major segments left by the collapse were pulverized and used as granite for road construction. Mother Nature is gradually absorbing the painful memories like a wound healing itself. So as nature does continue to reclaim San Francisco Canyon, it is our purpose to see that we don't forget that St. Francis Dam disaster and the impact it had on this community, state, and country. We have some time now for some questions. If anybody has any, I'd be glad to answer them if you have them. Yes, sir.
If that was the second worst disaster in California history, should I assume the first was the San Francisco earthquake?
Yes, you are. If you didn't hear that, yes, the worst disaster in California history was the 1906 earthquake and fires that followed it. Yes, sir.
The second worst, but they didn't find all the bodies, did they?
No, they never did find all the bodies. They rounded the number of dead up to 450. 101 of those were relegated to the disaster that they knew, but they didn't find.
But they assumed that because they didn't find all the bodies, had they found all the bodies, this would be the worst disaster.
Exactly. Because of the existing field workers, undocumented workers who camped out along the river in Fillmore and Santa Paula, and the fact that they found bodies on the beaches in Oxnard and San Diego, I assume the number went as high as 600 because there was just no telling how many workers and families were wiped out that didn't have regular addresses or communication with the community. Yes, sir.
Could a quake knock out the current Castaic reservoir and create a similar disaster?
I'm not an engineer, but I am told that it is safe and it is constantly monitored like all dams are now. It's hooked up, and it's not like the dam that went down in Idaho about 30 years ago, where it more or less imploded on itself and was eaten up and just went down in a matter of hours. But to answer your question is, I don't know that it could or it couldn't, but it's been there for 38 years or more, so I think it's doing well. Yes, sir.
What was the total height of the dam when it collapsed?
It was the total height of the dam was 205 feet at the center section.
You mentioned that his chief engineer was Van Norman. I remember my father talking about the Van Norman Dam. Do you know, does that still exist?
Oh yes, the Van Norman Reservoir is the reservoir right below the Cascades in Sylmar. It was damaged during the 1971 earthquake. They had to draw that down right away because it was going to flood out Sylmar or in that area. So then they rebuilt the reservoir further up next to the freeway. So it does still exist. It's Harvey Van Norman's dedication. It's dedicated to Harvey Van Norman. Yes. Yes, sir.
Is debris still found to this day?
Debris is everywhere up in San Francisco Canyon. It's stretched. We can find debris like 10 miles down from where it stood. It took a lot of it down. Yes.
I have pictures. They're on the historical website. My aunt came up here in 1928 of April, and she took pictures of the Edison trucks that were demolished and many, many pictures of every place that the dam entered and left. Now, what was the name of that area? Blue something?
Blue Cut?
Blue Cut. That's where the Edison...
That's right. It was on...
Where is this?
That's right at the Los Angeles Ventura County line, virtually at that county line.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
The whole mountain was moving as it was filled with water. Was this moving before or after the construction?
The question about whether the mountain was moving, it had nothing to do with the construction. This was a total geologic event. The mountain itself picked the wrong time to move in time. It was a large land movement. It wasn't an earthquake. The ground moved. And not just one section of it, the whole mountain was moving. It's called a Paleolithic landslide. Yeah.
Do you think it had something to do with the actual fact that they had made the dam, or would it would have moved obviously anyways, eventually, but the two together probably made it happen?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was one or all of those things combined which brought the dam down, yes.
Because I didn't realize that it was the whole section then.
Yeah, up until 1992, and Dr. Rogers made all the tests and evaluations on it that they brought out the theory, and it sounds right, so it fits.
Was the west side thrusting upwards?
I'm sorry, sir?
The west side thrusting upwards? You said there's pressure on the west side, but you didn't say what.
On the west side, the pressure was pressing right, not upwards, onto it.
Onto, okay.
Right, it was, the west side was immersed with water. It was just filling up and just swelling like a sponge and pushing on it, yes. Yes?
There was a time when Mulholland was vindicated from this, wasn't there, based on geological information he supposedly wouldn't have had knowledge of?
Exactly.
But my understanding is now that there were people who did know and that he could have gotten the information.
There are, again, back then, it was theory. And William Mulholland, for all of his greatness at the same time, was pretty much omnipotent. And he was pretty much, ego, yes. He believed in his success, believed that where the dam was going to be placed was sufficient. And he did consult with a geologist in 1922 before any construction was done, and that same geologist died that same year. So again, uplift theory was then a theory. Today it's a fact that you don't build a dam without a certain okay, there's engineers out there, so I'm not even going to go out there. So but certain aspects of the dam where they had relief wells up in the center section where they didn't have it on the other outer part of the dam. That's why those other sections went down so readily, apparently. So I'll give you Dr. Rogers' address if you want to call him. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry. I'd love to take more questions, and if you're on the bus, I'll take them there too, but we're going to have to get on the bus and get out to the site.